So we're halfway through the year, it's time to review some of the best books that I've read so far. My reading's been much broader this year. I've been reading lots of plays, which I don't normally read, I've read a comic for the first time, and I've got some non-fiction books as well, so there's quite a lot of different books in this list. First up we have From Hell by Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell. From Hell is a graphic novel that fictionalises the Whitechapel murders of Jack the Ripper. It also chronicles the absolute despair and horror of working class life and prostitution in Victorian London. In From Hell, Prince Albert, the son of Queen Victoria, falls in love with and has an illegitimate child with a former prostitute. In order to prevent scandal, Queen Victoria has this woman kidnapped and lobotomised, but not before one of her friends, Mary Jane Kelly, works out what has happened and decides to blackmail the prince, who along with her other friends, who together make the canonical five, these being the 5 women who were murdered by Jack the Ripper. Queen Victoria then enlists the help of the royal surgeon, Sir William Gull, and gets him to take care of these women. But Queen Victoria doesn't realise that Sir William Gull has nefarious motives himself, and this leads to a series of grisly, terrifying murders. This was my first comic book, and I absolutely loved it. It was completely engrossing from start to finish, and the Jack the Ripper crimes are something that I've always known about as someone from the UK, so it's just something that's embedded in our culture, something that we talk about a lot. These murders continue to fascinate so many years later, so this was the perfect comic book for me to dig into. It's not the most accurate or faithful in terms of what happened in these times. It's based off of a book that's basically a conspiracy theory book about why the women were murdered. But this doesn't really matter. It's a very compelling story, and there is a lot of legend and myth around the Jack the Ripper killings, so it makes sense that this book would take liberties with reality. Not only is it good in terms of the story, but really the way that it captures Victorian life, especially through the illustrations as much as the story itself, is just completely amazing. In fact, one of my favourite parts of the book is this scene where we have Sir William Gull going about his mourning. He's quite a rich man, he's the royal surgeon after all, and so the style of the artwork here is really bright, really light, barely any shadows as he's going about his day on the day that he commits one of the first murders. And then this is contrasted with the murder victim on her last day of life, which uses these thick black lines full of shadow, dark, despairing, just grim, and that contrast between these very two different styles of life I think is perfect. I haven't read any comics since this one, but I would definitely like to read more of Alan Moore and see what his other work is like, because I really enjoyed this, and it certainly got rid of a lot of preconceptions I had about comic books. At number 2, we have The People from the Abyss by Jack London. Jack London was a novelist, and he decided one day to travel to Whitechapel in the early 1900s to see how people lived in that time. And this book actually provided much of the backdrop for the atmosphere of From Hell, which is how I found out about this book. It was a reference point in that book, so I thought I would have a read of this book and just get a different perspective, a more realist perspective on what life was like. And this is even more bleak than From Hell, if that's possible. This is a must-read for anyone who wants a deep insight into the price that had to be paid in terms of the suffering of working class people in order to bring us many of the things that we appreciate today and take completely for granted. The lives of these people is absolutely brutal. They literally live from hand to foot. London describes them going around London constantly, from workhouse to workhouse, trying to seek new employment. Sometimes they get turned away, and there are all these laws that stop them from easily getting permanent work. For example, once you're turfed out of a workhouse, you have to go to one in a different district. You can't work for one in the same district again, just making their lives as difficult as possible, constantly keeping them ground down. In one of the most terrifying scenes, we have London with 2 men walking through town, and these men, whose rib cages are visible, are literally picking up rotten apple cores and orange peels from the street and eating them, because that might be the only food that they actually get. Men and women in the society don't even engage in personal relationships. There's another story of a young working class man who typically, you'd expect him to be going around sowing his wild oats, maybe looking for a wife, but actually no, he says he doesn't want a woman because with a woman would come responsibility in terms of children, and there's no way he can look after them, there's no way he can afford them, and so he denies himself the kind of romantic fulfillments that people take for granted today. Another story that really grabbed me was the story of a young woman called Harriet Walker, who was just 17 years old. She would walk 6 miles every day to and from work, where she would just make 8 shillings in a week, which is roughly £50 in today's money. And despite all of this effort, she got lead poisoning, and hid it from her boss because she didn't want to lose her job, and died while she was still 17. Suicide among working men is another popular topic of conversation too. At one point, London takes two men out for dinner. He decides that he takes pity on them. He can't conceal his disguise as a poor person. He takes them out for dinner, and while they're talking, they casually talk about suicide and the various ways in which they would do it if it came to it. It's a seriously bleak book, definitely one of the most depressing things I have ever read, but nevertheless it's a very interesting one that really just gives you an insight into a way of living that we don't really think about when we think about history. It also puts into perspective a lot of modern complaints about things like overwork and exploitation by one's employer into serious perspective. Number 3, we have a play, Hedda Gabler by Ibsen. This was my first Ibsen play. Hedda Gabler is something that's been on my reading list for ages, but I never got round to reading it. But I was talking with some friends about watching a play recently, and Ibsen came up, and I thought this is a good opportunity to try and push Hedda Gabler, which I did, and thank God we got to watch it. We watched this adaptation that stars Fiona Shaw, who many of you will know probably as Aunt Petunia from the Harry Potter films, and she does a marvellous job of bringing this character to life. In the play we have Hedda, who is a former socialite who is trapped in a marriage to a kindly but ineffectual academic man, so middle-class lifestyle that she's degraded herself to. She feels paralysed by this marriage, she's bored by the expectations of a middle-class housewife, and she's unable to have the kind of aristocratic parties and socialising that she was used to. But then something happens. She finds that she is able to influence the fate of a former lover of hers called Isla Lovborg, and this leads to some bloody and tragic consequences. In the version that I watched, Fiona Shaw plays Hedda in a very muted, quiet way. Right from the beginning of the play, she seems incredibly mentally unstable, but she still has these glimmers of that past life, that socialite life in certain moments, and she can use that to steer things into the direction that she wants. I think what's fascinating about Hedda as a character is she is so complicated that you can pretty much pull her off in any kind of style that you want. You know, you can rely on that kind of feminist interpretation where ultimately Hedda's just a victim of society. She's been ground down by becoming a wife, and she's just so bored that she has to do something, and so she takes drastic action. But equally, you could do a kind of femme fatale interpretation of Hedda, where she's more vindictive, more cruel, and she's just been waiting for this opportunity to do something terrible. There's just that much within the character that you can pretty much take it any way. And what I liked about Fiona Shaw is that she's all of these things. You know, there's a sense in which you can feel that she really is ground down by this life. But there's also a sense in which this is a woman who comes from an aristocratic background, and she can't deal with the fact that now she's in a more useful social class, that she has nothing to contribute. And I think this is shown by the fact that there are other female characters in the play who fit into these working class or middle class backgrounds who do manage to contribute, either whether through being mothers or through work. And so it seems like there is something there about Hedda maybe being a sort of representative of this falling aristocratic class that just don't really know what to do, and so do something incredibly dark when they get the chance. In any case, however one interprets Hedda, she's a fantastic character, and this is a fantastic play, and if you haven't read it, I would definitely recommend. And also recommend watching the Fiona Shaw version if you can get your hands on it. At number 4, we have another play, but much earlier now. This is Medea by Euripides. So I read quite a few Euripides tragedies, and I'll probably do a video on Greek tragedy at some point. If you're interested, let me know. But Medea was the first one that I read, and one that really stood out to me. It's also another play of an unhinged woman, and there seem to be quite a lot of those this year, so I don't know why that's the case, but I do seem to be enjoying unhinged women at the minute. Medea is a Greek tragedy that focuses on Medea, who is the wife of Jason. And at the start of the tragedy, we learn that Jason has forsaken Medea and gone to marry a daughter of King Creon. And he didn't consult Medea about this, and he tries to convince her that ultimately this is in her interests, but of course Medea isn't having any of that, and she plots an incredibly dark and brutal revenge against her husband. Medea is a very violent play, and it's also very ambiguous. I don't think it's meant to be Medea's tragedy, because she ends the play in a sort of almost victorious, valorized sense. After murdering her children, Jason finds out what she's done, and then she is in this chariot in the sky, and she sort of flies off, leaving Jason in despair. And it seems to me that it's Jason's tragedy, the tragedy being that he put his political interests above his personal ones. He chose to consolidate his own position in society, and Medea's as well, by abandoning her and marrying this other woman and just degrading Medea to a concubine. after she helped him in his quests as well. What I like about this and all the Greek tragedies that I've read is just that they are very clean plays. You can read them in an hour. In a way, they're simplistic, but they just know what they're doing. They're very focused and they're very economical. They begin with an inciting incident, it carries it along to its conclusion, and it all runs incredibly smoothly. I think if you want a sense of how to just tell a tightly constructed story, the Greek plays are a good place to start. Another Greek play next, we have Antigone, this time by Sophocles. Eteocles and Polynices are the two sons of Oedipus, and after Oedipus is exiled after the events of other plays, these two sons have a war in which they fight for the Theban throne, and it results in both of them dying as they fight each other. Oedipus's brother-in-law, Creon, then decides to take over the throne, and he decides to honour Eteocles, but he condemns Polynices to die and rot outside of the city. Antigone is the sister of these two brothers, and she's not too happy about this condemnation, and she decides to go against Creon and get her brother and give him proper burial rites, and this leads, as ever in Greek tragedy, to some tragic consequences. Just as in Medea you have this sort of conflict between two worlds, a political world and a more personal world, we have a similar thing happening in Antigone. We have the ruler Creon and the need to obey the ruler, and we have the rules of personal morality, the need to honour one's relatives, and these two things come into conflict. Antigone privileges the personal over the political, and Creon favours the political over the personal. I also think that of the three tragedians, Sophocles is my favourite so far. Even though this is the only play of his that I've read, I just really enjoyed this play. And its themes, still run through to this day. This relationship between personal morality and politics and one's duties to one's family versus one's duties to the state. All this stuff is so relevant, and it's such a well-told story as well, with some great characters. And again, just like with every other Greek play, it's just so clean and economical, and they're just such a pleasure to read. Number 6 is yet another play, but moving a little bit further forward in time, but not too far forward. We have Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost. King Ferdinand of Navarre and his noble companions, Lord Longueville, Lord Dumaine and Lord Brion, decide to commit themselves to a life of scholarly pursuits, and they forsake women for, I think it's 3 years. This absurd plot is eventually thwarted when a princess comes to the castle with her ladies-in-waiting, and the men immediately fall in love with these women, and comic things ensue from there. All I knew about Love's Labour's Lost is that it's meant to be one of Shakespeare's most complicated plays in terms of the language. It's meant to be rich, people usually call it a feast of language, and that is definitely true. This play is just completely loaded with puns and wordplay and beautiful bits of poetry. I was watching the BBC adaptation of this, which I always do for these plays, and yeah, you could just feel the essence of that, even when you couldn't quite follow the language. The way it rolled off the tongue was just beautiful to listen to. It was almost like music. The comedy itself was also quite good. It doesn't rely on the standard tropes of a lot of Shakespeare comedies. There is men in disguises, but it's not the usual gender-swapping thing that he uses in most of his other plays. And there's a lot of interesting tension between the characters. It's incredibly flirtatious, incredibly fun, and an incredibly underrated play as well. What's also interesting about this play is that it is comic throughout the whole thing, and then at the end we have, as the name would suggest, Love Labour's Lost. The lovers are put in a terrible situation when the father of the princess dies, and she tells the men that rather than just marry now, they have to go away for a set period of time and come back to them to sort of prove that they're actually serious. And so you end with this final ambiguity of, was this just kind of a summer fling? Will these men come back? We never know, because there's no sequel to this play, although people think that there was such a play that is now lost, called Love's Labour's 1, which would maybe indicate that they do come back. But we don't know that, and so we just end up with this very ambiguous and poignant play that deals with this issue of commitment. We have the men at the beginning committing to this life of scholarly pursuits at the expense of romantic love, and they realise through the course of the play that this was ridiculous, but then they end the play with trying to commit again very seriously to these women that they barely know, and then the women saying, well, you've not really proved yourself as very good at keeping your oaths, so maybe we need to wait, maybe we need to just take some time to actually work out whether these oaths are worth taking. So I thought that that's a very clever theme to the play, and it really does round it off. That being said, a lot of it did go over my head, because Although, like I said, the language is beautiful to listen to, sometimes it's hard to follow. So I think this is a play that I will have to sit down and read. And probably as a play, it's better to read it just because it's hard enough with Shakespearean language. But with the level of punning and all this stuff in this play, it really was difficult to follow. But I still enjoyed it very much all the same. Moving away from plays now and into philosophy, the next book is Art as Experience by John Dewey. So John Dewey is a philosopher, and he's typically known with a philosophical position called pragmatism that I won't go into. In this book, he lays down an aesthetic theory that I think is deeply interesting and one that actually captures a lot of my own intuitions about aesthetics. I also find his writing style incredibly engaging. At least with this book, I'm reading another book of his at the minute that's a bit more hard going, but with this book, he just has some really nice passages, some really nice quotes. It's got this sort of vibe of philosophers like Nietzsche and Hegel and Sartre, so it's got that sort of more artsy philosophical vibe. But he manages to not go too far into that where he becomes obscure. He has a certain degree of rigour, so you still understand what he's saying, and he also presents some very compelling arguments. Dewey does many things in this book. He covers lots of topics, so I'll just leave you with one of the key ideas. So we have this modern notion of art where we not only put art on a pedestal, but we also sort of distinguish it from real life. If you want to see art, you should go to a museum, or if you want to appreciate art, you should sort of detach yourself from real life to really contemplate it. And this is something that I somewhat held previously. But Dewey argues that this sort of perspective on art is only really a recent one, and that actually, if you go back further in history, before we started putting things in museums, art was very much invested in people's lives, people's everyday lives. He uses the example of the Parthenon in ancient Greece to say, well, look, you have this ancient building, and to us it's sort of a piece of art that we would look at in a detached way, but for them it was something that served a purpose. And so you had this fusion of art or aesthetics with everyday life. And Dewey argues that if you really want to have an aesthetic experience, you need to do that. You need to connect with experience, not detach yourself from it. It's a really fascinating book that takes a very broad perspective on art. It looks at all the different arts, and I just think it's fascinating, and I think it's definitely going to have a lasting impact on my own thinking about art. So I definitely would recommend, if you're interested in the more theoretical side of the arts and aesthetics, definitely read this book. And now back to a novel. Next up we have The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. Donna Tartt's The Goldfinch tells the story of Theodore Decker, a young boy whose life changes when he loses his mother when a bomb goes off in a terrorist attack in an art museum. I recently talked about this one in my ranking video of Donna Tartt's novels, and although it did come in third place, that's not because I think it's a poor book. In fact, I think it's pretty fantastic. I guess when you spend nearly 10 years writing every single book, you're never going to really disappoint your audience. In many ways, The Goldfinch is a love letter to Charles Dickens. Theo's story is reminiscent of a bit of Oliver Twist, a bit of David Copperfield, and a bit of Great Expectations, all rolled into one, with maybe a slightly more cynical and dark edge to those novels, which typically with Dickens, even when things get gritty, they tend to end in a more optimistic, happy way. And this novel doesn't really do that. There are some lights in the clouds, but it's still a pretty grim and bleak ending for Theo. Tartt also grapples with some really interesting themes here. She looks at how parents and children relate to each other, and how children sometimes can become not just like their parents, but sometimes more like the parent that they hate rather than the parent that they like. And this is something that we see with Theo. That being said, I do have some issues with this book. I do think that, and this is why it came last in my Tartt ranking, is because I do think it's steeped too much in Dickens, and so it lacks some of the more distinctive feeling of Tartt's books. That's not to say that she's copying Dickens, it's just that you really feel what the kind of reference points are for this book, in a way that with her other books, you do get the reference points, but they don't feel as embedded in the novel as they do this time around. At number 9, we're going back to Shakespeare, this time with Julius Caesar. I really wasn't expecting to enjoy Julius Caesar as much as I did, but wow, I just thought this was a great play. All I knew of the play is obviously the obvious, that Brutus kills Caesar at some point, and of course the lend me your ears speech. The play focuses on Brutus as he is seduced into murdering Caesar by a man called Cassius, who is jealous of Caesar because Caesar has become very popular with the people, and the people suggest that they want to crown him, although Caesar does refuse the crown several times. Brutus is swayed into this because he is concerned about Rome falling into a monarchy with Caesar having too much influence, and so he kills Caesar along with some conspirators, and then the play takes us through the aftermath of this. I think Cassius was probably my favourite character in the play. His relationship with Brutus is very complicated. Up to the murder, they sort of get along quite well, but afterwards they have a sort of rocky relationship. But ultimately they manage to stick together and they support each other as much as they can. And Cassius himself even comes across as sympathetic. At first I took him as a sort of Iago, an early, sort of rendering of Iago, the sort of bitter person who is trying to persuade someone who's more powerful than them to do something terrible. But Cassius actually is humanized in a few moments of the play, and he seems to even regret his decisions somewhat as the play progresses. And his relationship with Brutus is quite sweet, even if it's based on, coming together to murder someone else. So I thought that was an interesting touch, because usually Shakespeare's villains, like Iago, for example, they're interesting, fascinating villains, but they're often not very morally conflicted, so I like to see that when it comes up. I also think that this ambiguity sort of runs through the whole play as well. Unlike many of Shakespeare's other tragedies where, the death of the principal person happens at the end and you really feel for them, there's a sort of ambiguity with Julius Caesar. Caesar's barely in the play, he dies partway through it, and Brutus's death and Cassius's death are somewhat tragic too. And so it really seems like Shakespeare maybe was conflicted here. Did Brutus do the right thing in killing Caesar? Was it right to do that for the sake of Rome? Or was Brutus ultimately also just a little bit jealous of the power of Caesar? It's not obvious in the play how we're supposed to respond to it. And I think that's why I really appreciated this play, because I just wasn't expecting that level of complexity and ambiguity. At number 10, we have the Iliad by Homer. So this is the story of Achilles and his rage during the Trojan War. Although it doesn't start or end with the Trojan War, symbolically the death of Hector at the end of the story pretty much signals the end of hope for the Trojans. On my first read of the Iliad, I really couldn't take in the poem all that much. I read it in large chunks, and I was overwhelmed by the very long, drawn-out and repetitive battle scenes, interspersed with these character moments, which as far as I was concerned at the time, were just too brief to really get invested in. And then we had the gods who, while it's quite fun to read the gods, because they're just so catty, they felt to me like they just sort of pushed the story forward, and so it didn't feel like there were really any stakes in the story either, because of the role the gods played. I read the Iliad much slower this time around, and that really helped me appreciate the story more than when I was reading it in big chunks. The battle scenes didn't seem so repetitive to me because I was breaking up my reading, and so they felt like a nice variation within a chapter rather than something just constantly repeating itself. Kind of like when you watch a TV show that has regular fight scenes in it. There's other stuff going on in each episode, so you can tolerate the fight scene, it's interesting, and it doesn't feel too repetitive. I could also appreciate the ways in which the story was building upon itself and how the characters were really playing in the story. On this read, I really connected more with characters like Achilles and his rage, more than I did in the first read where he was barely in it and just came across as quite petulant and ridiculous. Also, I think it's important to recognise when it comes to Greek culture perhaps, that submission to fate is a big part of that culture, and this I think is what accounts for the lack of agency in not just the characters but also the gods. Even the gods themselves are subjected to fate. It's not like they come in and stop fate from happening. We're told what is fated for these characters, and the gods typically aid and abet fate. They don't go against it, and they don't seem to have the power to go against it either, which I think is interesting as a plot point, because in more modern novels we're obsessed with agency, and we tend to, if a character doesn't have agency, we tend to view that as a weakness of the storyteller. But it seems like in this case, what we have is a world where people accept that life is scary and brutal, and it cuts down even the strongest, most powerful people, and even sometimes the gods. And so there's a sense in which the theme of the Iliad and the theme of the story is that sometimes you just have to submit to fate. It doesn't matter how great you are. And so that actually makes the whole lack of agency way more significant. And in some sense true, because there is a sense in which no matter how great you are, ultimately fate is going to play some role in your life, whether that's ending it or just dealing you a bad hand once in a while. Alright, that's it for this list. Let me know what books you've been enjoying reading this year. What are your favourites? If you have any books that you've really hated this year, also let me know. And if you've read any of these books, let me know in the comments. Until next time, ta-ra!